at your very first top 5 paper, how does citations to those earlier published papers, how do those change now that you have this new exposure from this top 5 paper? And then we want to look at this, how this Mattew effect differs for men versus women. So data-wise, we have compiled a very big database that effectively takes all of the authors who published for the very first time a top 5 paper between 1986 to 2015. And then it goes and identifies all of their papers that they then publish previous to that top 5 paper. So it's a comprehensive database tracking each of the entire corpus of research outputs and citations for every economist, again, who published at least one regular issue, full-length original research paper between 1986 to 2015 in one of these top 5 journals. And this gives us about 3,500 economists. I didn't write this here, but I think about 300 or 350 of which are women. The database, the bibliographic data on the top 5 publications comes from a couple other papers of mine and a colleague of mine, Moon. The bibliographic data that we have for the non-top 5 publications, as well as for all of the citations to all of the papers, comes from the Web of Science. So just to kind of reiterate the research question we're looking at, we're trying to understand how publishing in a top 5 journal for the very first time affects citations to one's already published papers, and whether or not this effect is different across genders. And so what we're effectively going to end up doing is an event study approach, which is pretty much what everybody, I think, actually, up till now, everybody's doing event studies. So we are also doing an event study. And what we're doing here is we're going to regress citations on, of course, these indicator variables for each of the year relative to the very first top 5 publication, as well as that indicator variable with whether the author was a female or a male. Importantly, if we were just looking at the Mattew effect, then we're really just within the same person. We're really just saying, okay, well, you're fixing the papers. How do your citations change before and after the top 5 papers? So it is in effect, arguably a causal impact of the Mattew effect. And we don't have to include any other controls. No question? No. Do you have a question?
If I can give a question. So my question is the following. What do you do about people whose job market paper is a top 5 paper? Because if those are differentially selected by gender, then that's going to affect the estimate of
Absolutely. So the Mattew effect, we think we can get a pretty good causal estimate. Now, if we want to look at the heterogeneous impact of the Mattew effect across gender, then we have to figure out, well, how many citations should you get, right? Because otherwise, we're just comparing the same person and we're saying before and after the shock. But now we're looking at, okay, well, we want to compare you had the shock, how big is that shock for you, versus you had the shock, how big is that shock for you? So we have to figure out, effectively have controls for, say, the quality of the underlying paper, which we try to do imperfectly, and I'll show you.
Oh, sorry, I wasn't clear. What I meant is, to be in your sample, your first paper cannot be a top 5.
Oh, yes. The first,
right?
Yeah. It could be your job market paper if you published another paper, however, before it, and then you would be in the data set.
But so if men are more likely to publish the first paper in a top 5, this is a sample selection issue.
Yes. Yeah, that's why we have these controls for quality. And we try to do this. Of course, one could always, and we may not be able to, but we do our best to try to control for the quality effectively of the control for both the heterogeneity in the shock, as well as heterogeneity in the actual papers that are published before the top 5 was published. So we try to do both of those things, and we'll explain how we do that. Okay, so and Q, actually, I'll explain now. Q is supposed to capture the quality of the paper that is being cited. So this is the corpus of papers that were published before the top 5 paper. And to control for that, we use proxy. Actually, I'll show you on the next slide. We actually use the average number of citations to papers that are published after the top 5 paper, and the average annual number of citations to Q, to that same paper. So we're using basically citations to papers that are not already in our database as our kind of proxy for that. We're also we're very open to other suggestions. As far as like heterogeneity in the actual, there's also heterogeneity, as you say, in the top 5, in the sense of they might be published in different years, and men and women may be publishing in different years, and that could be driving citations. So effectively, those kinds of differences could effectively be correlated with our variable of interest, as well as gender. And so we could also include fixed effects for the actual journal of top 5 paper, as well as the journal of the cited paper, as well as the fixed effects for the year of the top 5 paper, and fixed effects for the year of the cited paper. Those are our baseline specifications. We've also run it with a whole bunch of extra ones. We don't see much of a difference otherwise. We'll show you really where we see a big difference. But we're also open up, feel free to ask if it's robust to other controls. But also, if you have a good idea for further controls, we would be very open to that. Okay. All right, so here are our basic results. So what do we have here? So the the blue line, this is the Mattew effect, and this is for everybody, not just men, but also for women. So this is basically this beta coefficient right here. So it's the impact on citations to everyone at the moment at each. You have obviously the T is the fixed effects for the year from top 5 publication, and our T0 is then the year that top 5 publication is actually published, and we see that it's pretty close to 0. So the number of citations that you get to your papers published before your top 5 is close to 0. And then you publish a top 5, which is at the center of the graph. That's our kind of T equals 0. And you see a big jump in citations. So that's the Mattew effect, and we see that for everybody. Now the red line, this is measuring the Mattew effect. Well, in essence, it's this gamma coefficient. So it's this interaction between this Mattew effect and the gender of the author, whether the author is female or not. So what this is suggesting is that it's actually negative before the top 5 publication is being published. So before we have a top 5 publication, it looks like women are effectively being undercited, assuming that we have captured differences in the quality of the underlying cited paper correctly. So they're being undercited. And then we have a top 5 publication. And not only do women benefit from this Mattew effect, but they benefit from an extra effect on top of it. We call this kind of like a Matilda compensation effect. So they have this Matilda effect before the top 5 publication. Then there's the exposure of the top 5 publication. It brings attention to their previously published work, and women benefit even more than men after that occurs, right? And yes. For paper. Yes.
Exactly that.
I don't have, in that sense, yes. We also have included the number of papers that they actually have as a control. We don't in the baseline specification, but it doesn't really make a difference. It doesn't make a difference at all. Yes.
You could check whether the paper that gets more citation after the top 5 paper is published is in the same field, like with the same JL codes or not.
So we do at the end, we'll tell, is this paper cited in the top 5 paper?
Oh, no.
Oh, no,
So
no.
the paper that gets the big boost, because there are 2 stories, right? Yeah. One is that the person becomes visible and her or his papers get cited across the board, or that their contribution to that field becomes more visible.
Yeah, so I think we're doing part of that, and towards the end. And so if I could come back to that towards the end, I think it might answer that. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
So this pattern of results is consistent with Bayesian updating, where priors about women's ability is lower than for men's. That seems slightly different than my interpretation of what we call the Mattew effect, which is undue credit for something that isn't deserved. Here, the inefficiency is sort of on the priors and why we're getting our priors wrong. But the experiment here, we're updating seems to be completely consistent with Bayesian sort of updating. No?
So I think kind of yes. So if I understand correctly, in the sociology literature, you can't really differentiate between those two worlds in a sense. So the Mattew effect is something, yes, it could be, but so you imagine the world in which this person had not gotten the top 5, then they would have been under-recognized for their whole world, for their whole lives, according to the Bayesian theory. Yes. So, yeah.
That in my mind. Maybe it's just semantic, but
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. Yeah, I think it's not super clear what exactly the Mattew effect in that sense is. The way that we're just defining it is that you have a shock and you get more attention as a result of the shock. But we could also call it something else. Maybe we'll call it the Luke effect. I don't know, I'm just making that up. But yeah, no, it kind of depends on how you define it, and it is not a very clearly defined thing. But here we're defining it effectively to encompass both of those possibilities. Okay. Next, what we do is we include fixed effects for the actual top 5 paper. So this is basically restricting the sample to a top 5 paper that would have obviously a male and a female author on them. And it's saying, okay, how does this change if we fix the actual exposure, because they're getting the same top 5 paper? Do we see the same effect? Yes, largely. So we do see that the Matilda effect prior to publication of the top 5 is, it's still negative, but it's much more noisily estimated. But we still see that there is a big Mattew effect nevertheless, and there is a female kind of Matilda overcorrection effect. So the female Mattew effect is above and beyond what we're already seeing for the male Mattew effect. So we're also seeing basically that, conditional on top 5 paper, these female co-authors are receiving a bigger bump in citations to their previously published papers relative to their male co-authors. Here we show evidence for solo versus co-author papers. So on the left, we have solo author papers, and on the right, we have co-author papers. And we do see a big difference here. So this Mattew effect, again, as we defined it, but it could be just like a general Bayesian effect. It's present when authors kind of publish solo authored or co-author papers in top 5 papers, but it's really present when we look at co-author papers. So this may be a sample, this may be the issue that there aren't a lot of solo authored top 5 papers by women. So maybe that's one of the reasons why we're seeing this very noisy effect. But irrespective, we see a big Matilda effect, or a big, much lower citations to these people before the top 5 paper is actually published. And then after the publication of the top 5 paper, we see that there's a much slower correction. So a slower Matilda correction. So it's several years afterwards before this effect even becomes positive. And in any case, it's never going to be significant, right? So women with co-author top 5 papers experience an extra bump in citations that's clearly there, whereas women with solo author papers experience a much smaller and insignificant extra bump. Now, this is what we consider to be kind of one of the most important or interesting part of the research. And this is looking at, okay, these papers that were published before the top 5 paper, were these papers cited in the top 5 paper, or were they not cited in the top 5 paper? So it's kind of saying, all right, is this Mattew effect coming to concentrate on papers that are in the same research agenda as the top 5 paper, or is it instead going to papers that were not cited in the top 5 paper and therefore are probably new research agendas or other research agendas? And we see, first of all, on the left-hand side, right here, on the left-hand side, these are papers that were cited in the top 5 paper, okay? And we see this is where the majority of citations are coming from, right? Papers that were actually cited in that top 5 paper. And that makes sense, because effectively what's happening is you're publishing a top 5 paper, people are reading it. Once they read it, they go and they cite it, okay? But we don't see any gender effect whatsoever. So the Matilda effect, so this red thing, this is consistently 0, both before and after the impact of the top 5 paper. When we look at the papers that are not cited in the top 5 paper, and this is on the right-hand side, we still see a Mattew effect. They are also getting attention. So if you are publishing a top 5 paper for the first time, Even the papers you don't cite in that top 5 paper are getting extra citations. But this is also where we're seeing the big gendered effect. So this is where women are getting the additional boost in citations, okay? So this is the only place where we actually see this significant impact on women and this kind of correction from the previous Matilda effect. And this is also the only place where we see the actual Matilda effect. So we're seeing that these papers are the ones that are being undercited before the top 5 paper, and women are then getting the extra bump after the top 5 paper. So again, women they don't experience a bump in citations to papers cited in the top 5 article, but they do experience a bump in citations to papers that are not cited in the top 5 article. So kind of a summary of the results. So when authors are publishing for the very first time in a top 5 journal, we see a big bump for everybody, but especially for women in the citations that they're getting for their already published papers. We see this bump even when we control for the actual shock of publishing. So we're looking at the same paper and we look at male co-authors versus female co-authors. We're seeing that women are still getting an extra bump in citations. So when men and women co-author in the same top 5 paper, women receive a larger subsequent bump in citations to their previously published work. It's also only present for papers that are not cited by the top 5 paper. So both men and women experience the same bump in citations of papers they cite in the top 5 paper, but it's only women who experiences additional bump in citations, or the only time women experience an additional bump in citations is when it's among the papers that are not cited in the top 5 paper. And again, we also find evidence of the Matilda effect for papers that were published before authors' first top 5. Generally, we find it, especially among solo author papers. Okay, so the question is, what's going on? And this is really where we have, can't really see it, but this is really where it's a big work in progress for us. And so we would love to, we are open to discussing, we would love to discuss it with anybody who's interested. But what we're currently interpreting this up as this kind of extra bump in citations after author's first top 5 publication is kind of evidence of this partial correction of the so-called Matilda effect that potentially exists before the publication of the top 5 paper. So effectively what's happening is the Mattew effect is helping us to correct for this previous Matilda effect that existed before the exposure of publishing a top 5 paper. So women are initially undercited relative to men, but the exposure of a top 5 paper brings to them like basically their previously published research is getting a lot more exposure and people are starting to cite it more. Yeah.
Two interpretations we discussed before is really critical because I would say, look, where is there scope for me to learn the most about an author from the signal, this public signal of publishing in the top 5? I'm going to update my prior belief most on their single author papers and papers that are in somewhat the same field. That I thought those were the two cases where you don't find any gender effect. I update more when it's co-authored, when that's a more noisy signal of individual ability, and when it's not actually cited in the main paper, it's an unrelated field. So that seems more in line with priors being the same, but the Mattew effect actually being in favor of giving disproportionate credit to women relative to men, as opposed to the prior differences, which is to say that we're undervaluing women and we're updating. The policy implications are almost the opposite, depending on those two cases. The evidence you've shown here is against the learning model.
I think the big thing is, first of all, do we have good estimates that make it so that we can actually compare male and female author papers conditional on getting a top 5 paper? And can we look at this body of previously published papers and can we standardize it in a way so that these two effects are comparable? And if we were able to do that perfectly, then I would agree with you, okay? I don't think we're able to do it perfectly. And in particular, the ways in which we are actually adjusting for, say, the quality, the way that we're trying to do this is, if anything, probably going to be biased against women. So the average citation, there is in general, like it's been citations to, so you take 2 papers, you take one paper that is identical, but it's male authored, and you take another paper that's identical, but it's female authored. The male author paper does, in several studies, has been shown to get more citations than the otherwise identical female author paper. So when we use like this average number of citations to papers published after the top 5 paper, we think that's a good measure, but it's still going to kind of underestimate this quality. And it's probably also the same thing for the average annual number of citations to the top 5 paper. So it's the same kind of phenomenon. So I would say, given those are probably biased downwards, I would be more inclined to consider it kind of a correction. But we can't really rule those two things out. And that's why we're open definitely to, I mean, if you guys could think of other things that you think might be interesting, we would, other ways to kind of capture, to make these Matthew effects, or these effects comparable across gender. Yeah, we would love to. But yeah, that's where we are. Yeah.
Are you learning about the individual? So you were underestimating, now it's like, okay,
Here is a very good author. I should check what else they're doing? Or are you learning about the field? Which is, you know, I would do it by JEL codes.
If I had to be honest, I think it's both, right? So I think that there is some learning. Yeah, go on.
The implications, as Imran was saying, are very different.
They are very different. I would argue, however, to some extent, from a policy perspective, because it's really hard to be able to kind of disentangle those two things. It's not, you can still do policy even if you're not 100% sure if something is actually, I don't think it's fully driven by the individual. And it's probably also driven both by the individual as well as by social factors, right? So in a sense, you could you see this effect, you see it happening, and you have two different interpretations, but you could still come up with policy that helps regardless. Does that make sense? So that's all I'm, yeah. Yeah.
When people see a paper published in the top 5, in general, it's a signal certain. Sorry, I was saying that when people see a paper published in the top 5, it's a signal that a certain methodology or agenda has, it's at the frontier, 1, and 2, there's a broad interest in that agenda. So in that sense, I think it makes a lot of sense in a model where, there's imperfect information and this is a signal, etc. It's optimal that there is an increase in the citations of the previous work of the authors that is in the same agenda, right? Which is what you find. And there you don't find any gender bias.
No.
And that's kind of the optimal response, in a pure information model. And then you do find a difference where you shouldn't see any updating, right? Because this is unrelated work by the authors. So there is more of a signal about the author. And in that second case is when you see a gender bias. So I think in that sense, your results speak towards women being undervalued or there being a bias, because in the second case, you shouldn't see any update and that's where you see it. That's the way I would read the results. But I wouldn't talk about Matthew or Matilda effect. I would talk about I would think about this in a model where an optimal reaction to information is what you call the Matthew effect.
Mm-hmm.
And then a bias, in signal extraction is what you call the Matilda effect, right? In the second case, there is a bias or misallocation of attention. And in the first case, it seems that it's an optimal response to imperfect information.
Yeah, so I would just say, if you think about it on the individual, that's yes. But also think about like on an individual point of view. Okay, so let's assume that there are in fact perhaps subtle differences between men and women in the sense that like maybe women just for various reasons they address questions in a different way, right? In a way that has been ignored. So it's not really so before that, their research has been ignored because of the way that they're actually addressing it. I don't know how that is. I'm putting this out as a possibility. So it's not really the gender per se. It's just that, men don't actually ask questions in that way. And that's why it's being ignored, not the actual person. But then when they get the exposure of the top 5, then people go and look at that research and they think, oh, actually, that's pretty good. Oh, so it's in a sense, it's not the individual then, it's the actual topic then. Does that make sense? But I think that those are kind of the same thing. It's like we're getting at the same, like it is the individual, but it isn't. Does that, that's what I'm, yeah. Yeah, no, that's.
So please forgive me if you say this already, but what do you know about the papers who cite these papers. So are they women? Are they experienced? Are those people from other fields? Because this can tell you something about who is getting the attention. It's like people who are publishing in other fields that are coming there because they discovered there is something new, or like with high demand, or are women citing women or men citing men.
So in these baseline results, we're just counting the numbers, but we also had another one, which I'm not showing here, where we actually broke it down by citation. So then it was just the dependent variable is just a binary variable equal to 1, whether a paper was cited in a given year. And then we were able to control for a lot more things. We saw the same thing. What we didn't do, and what we plan to move on to next is look at, okay, well, are these being cited in economics or outside of economics? And I imagine, well, our initial tests, when we've looked at actual, like whether are these being cited in the top 5 or the not top 5, we haven't really seen much of we've seen the same patterns. But I wonder if actually some of these citations are because of exposure outside of economics. That's just a possibility, but I can't answer that yet. That's on our list of things to do. And we think that whatever we find would be interesting. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, thanks. So just in thinking about the interpretation of this, you keep on talking about like undervaluing and bias against women, but you could also just tell a story here about information acquisition being costly. It's hard. There's a lot of papers out there. It's costly to find out about all of them and cite them all. If, for example, women didn't travel as much as men, or for some reason were not as visible, then I just could not know about them because I hadn't spent the extra cost. And now suddenly that cost has come down. So that's still a market failure, and but it's a kind of slightly different interpretation. And from a policy point of view, matters a lot, right?
Yes, so that would, again, that's kind of, so you could have the actual updating, you could have these are slightly different questions, and it's just bringing, because there are fewer women to actually, it's just bringing more exposure, and that's actually bringing to things that are understudied. Or you could even look at something, say, well, women are not being able to get this attention, and then it's giving them a shock of attention, and then that's actually really helping them get attention to it. So yes, that's another way. In essence, you can't really differentiate between any of those, at least as far as we are aware. We're not able to. We would like to interpret this from an information point of view, but leave all of these as possibilities, if that makes sense. Yeah. So, and the key I think here is really, so when we do robustness checks, we don't find, the only thing that we see that matters really is whether or not this paper was cited in the top 5 or not cited in the top 5, right? Nothing else. It's not that they don't. It's not that they don't matter. It's just they don't. If they matter, it's hardly at all, right? So what we think is actually going on is an aggregation of all of these things, right? And I think the point here, and this is kind of a point more generally about sometimes about using observational data in these settings, is that kind of gender is actually important because it's like it's basically inextricably tangled into how we're going to get at this, but it may not per se be about gender, right? So, and it's just there may be factors that are effectively correlated with gender in a way that we cannot disentangle, but they still are driving it. So it's still about gender, even if it isn't always explicitly about gender. So yeah. Yeah. So as far as the policy implications, I want to emphasize that these are very tentative. And so if somebody goes away saying, Erin said this, Erin did not say this, these are just suggestions, okay? So, but again, one of the big things we think about this paper is that there is this extra exposure for publishing in a top 5 journal. And this is accruing to papers that women do not cite in their top 5 paper. So taking this view that this is kind of this is a correction for a Matilda effect, which is not necessarily the case, but assuming that this is a correction for the Matilda effect that existed before the exposure that came from the top 5 paper, it kind of says that the Mattew effect is effectively, or it's putting the spotlight on these research agendas that would not have otherwise gotten appropriate spotlight, right? So it suggests we may want to bring attention to the people. So, I mean, the obvious solution here might be, well, let's just publish more in top 5 journals, but that's not going to happen. So instead, maybe we want to look into, and I think this is already kind of being done, but having some attention being brought to the agendas of women who are not publishing in top 5 journals, either because they're too junior at the moment, or because they have chosen a publishing path, a career path that does not target those journals. So they can be senior women who are, in fact, however, not really looking to publish in these top 5 papers. And then there may be some underappreciated research agendas in that area. And the other thing we kind of want to highlight, and again, I'm not suggesting this is something that, tread carefully. This is just a suggestion. It should be considered very carefully if used in any kind of HR decisions, but it also may be informative about the signal, gender differences in the signal being received by the citation counts on the actual performance of researchers, conditional on having a top 5 journal. And again, if you assume that this correction post top 5 paper is actually it's a correction for a previous underappreciation of female research, then it may suggest that as other research has shown, it's not a good idea to compare the citations of female authors versus male authors, especially in papers that are not cited very often, in the sense that women are going to be undercited. But the problems that may cause, the underestimation of women's performance that may cause may be less of an issue if you have a lot of exposure to your research. So if women have, in fact, say a top 5 publication. So conditional on having a paper published in a highly ranked journal, citations may more accurately reflect men's and women's relative research performance than it would among scholars who do not have that kind of exposure. So this Matilda effect might, it might not be as large among male and female researchers who have gotten a lot of exposure to their research. So it might be more appropriate to use them to evaluate different types of research or in performance. But again, I mentioned that only as kind of a suggestion. It should be very, very hesitant. Okay, that is the end of the presentation, but I'd love to have any comments. Again, it's very much a work in progress. Yes.
So you can check whether there is a discontinuity at the top 5, right? You could see what's the effect of your first GIA or Restart or, good general journals which are not top 5 to see whether it is just visibility, like it changes continuously, or whether it's this one hit.
Yeah, we can absolutely do that. I mean, I think one of the reasons why we haven't done that is just because then you're starting to break. There aren't a lot of women, right? And so and a lot of them tend to be published in QJE and AER. There are much fewer women in Econometrica, Restud, and JPE. So, but yeah, that's absolutely something we could do. Yeah, I'm not sure how informative, but yeah.
So would it be possible to use other events that led to greater exposure of women? So prizes, there have been some reforms, like the EEA started having rules that there need to be 50% women on long lists. My experience is that those things had quite big effects on bringing underseen women into the presence, and so that might help disentangle a bit some of the different effects.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's nice about using the top 5 is that it's kind of direct. It's like you get this top 5. Most of these people, when they get their first top 5, they don't have a huge publication history before them. So it's kind of it's like people are reading the paper. They're thinking, oh, I need to cite that. Then they're citing it. So the transmission mechanism is very direct. So I think it would be really useful to do this, say, on other big papers like Nature or like management science. So that are big journals that are outside of econ. I think you might also see it in some of these, in Azulé, they see definitely the Mattew effect in, say, the Howard Hughes Institute reward and then citations. I don't know if we'll see the gendered effect there. Yes.
Dig down into understanding its differences in priors is to look at sort of other markers of people's prominence. So we know that, the networks, there are huge returns to networks. So if you took people in less prominent departments, would you see similar effects there? And so I think the issue that you're picking up here is much broader. It's just that we rely in science on networks, and that creates disadvantages for many, and signals that we get of their ability through, say, publishing in the top 5 can benefit, can have those spillover effects on their careers.
We did in we did show it kind of, I don't show them here, but broken down by um, the rank of the department of the person, who's publishing the top 5, when they published their top 5. There wasn't any kind of clear information. It was broadly in these same lines, and there wasn't really a difference between higher ranked and lower ranked that was very clear. But I also wonder if, it's not to say it's not there. That's kind of what we see with everything. It's almost like, yeah, that's probably part of the story. It's just not enough to really see a big thing that is visible in the graphs. Does that make sense?
I wonder if there's gender differences in the propensity to cite as well.
Oh, yeah, we did, we deleted any citations that were linked to the actual, the Web of Science ID of the person of the top 5 papers. So we hopefully have deleted all of the self-citations, but it would be interesting to only look at those, yes.
No, so I meant when you split by papers that were cited in their top 5 publication versus not. So it could be that if women self-cite less, they have a body of research that is actually closely aligned with what they are publishing in the top 5. And this is why you see this gender difference in those.
Yeah, it could be. So we don't see any, you mean basically, so the ones that are not being cited are very different, and that's why we're seeing that, yeah, that could, effectively be, in that sense, then it would be a field effectively, fully driven by field. When we do, I will say, I'm not sure it's fully field in the sense that when we do try to control for fields, we don't see, again, it's the same problem, right? So not to say that field isn't important, it's just clearly, it's not like it's you put it in there and then it explains everything. So that's, yeah.
Talk about, right,